Caroline?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. The President's been spotted out and about a number of times with bandages on his hands. Could you please explain what that is about? Secondly, he noted on Truth Social the other day that he had aced 3 cognitive tests. Could you please clarify when those tests took place?
I can do that at a later date. I obviously don't have that in front of me. The President has spoken about that quite extensively throughout the years. As for the bandages on the hand, we've also given you an explanation for that in the past. The President is literally constantly shaking hands. The Oval Office is like Grand Central Terminal. He is meeting with more people than any of you even know about on a daily basis. He's also on a daily aspirin regimen, which is something his physical examinations has said in the past as well, which can contribute to that bruising that you see.
Okay, so the White House just held what might be the most disastrous press conference of Trump's entire presidency. And I'm not exaggerating when I say this thing was an absolute train wreck from start to finish. We're talking full meltdown mode, complete loss of message control, and a communications team that looked like they wanted to crawl under the podium and disappear. This wasn't just a bad day at the office. This was the kind of press conference that political science professors will use as a case study in how not to handle a crisis for the next 20 years. And the reason this matters so much, the reason we need to talk about this right now, is because what happened in that briefing room yesterday tells us something fundamental about where this administration is at this moment. We're not talking about a minor stumble or an off day. We're talking about an administration that appears to be losing its grip on the basic mechanics of governing, and that has massive implications for everything from domestic policy to international credibility to the 2026 midterms. This is a story about power, about control, about what happens when an administration's internal chaos becomes impossible to hide from public view. Now, before we dive into what actually went down, I need to talk to you about something important. The mainstream media is going to cover this story, obviously, but here's the thing. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. They're either going to downplay how bad this really was because they don't want to seem too critical, or they're going to turn it into pure entertainment without giving you the real context about what this means for American governance. That's why we built US Power Alert to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. We break down what's actually happening in Washington without the filter, without the access journalism nonsense, without worrying about maintaining relationships with powerful people who might cut us off if we tell the truth. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines and understand what's really driving American politics right now, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We bring the news straight to you every single day, with the kind of analysis you're not going to get from cable news or legacy newspapers. Just hit the subscribe button below to join us. And if you want to support this work and be part of a community that truly cares about the truth, about understanding the real mechanisms of power, this is your moment. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and drop a comment below, telling us what you think about this absolute disaster of a press conference. So here's what happened. The White House scheduled this press conference with about 6 hours' notice, which should have been the first red flag. Because when an administration gives you that little advance warning, it usually means something has gone seriously wrong, and they're trying to get ahead of it before the story spirals completely out of control. The stated purpose was to address recent questions about various policy initiatives and to clarify the administration's position on what the press secretary described as some misunderstandings. That language alone, those soft euphemisms, that should have told everyone that this was damage control mode. But what actually unfolded was so much worse than anyone expected. The press secretary came out first, looking visibly nervous, and tried to deliver what was clearly a pre-prepared statement about how the administration was on track with its policy agenda, and how certain false narratives were being pushed by political opponents and, quote, elements of the media that have never given this president a fair shake. Already you can see the defensive posture, the attempt to preemptively blame critics before anyone even asks a question. But then the questions started, and that's when everything fell apart. The first question was relatively straightforward, about reports that several senior staff members had resigned, or were considering resigning over disagreements about policy direction. The press secretary's answer was rambling, defensive, and didn't actually address the question. She talked about normal staff turnover, and the dynamic nature of any White House. But when pressed on whether specific high-profile departures had occurred, she said she wasn't prepared to comment on personnel matters, and then contradicted herself 30 seconds later by confirming that one of those people was, in fact, no longer with the administration. That's basic stuff. You either have a clear line on personnel questions, or you don't answer them at all. What you don't do is fumble around in real time trying to figure out what you're allowed to say. But it gets worse. The next question was about legal challenges to several executive orders, and specifically about whether the White House counsel's office had advised the president that certain actions might be on shaky legal ground. The press secretary's response was to say that she wasn't going to get into internal deliberations, which is standard. But then she volunteered that the president has full confidence in his legal team and in the constitutional basis for his actions, which immediately prompted a follow-up about why. If the legal basis was so solid, multiple federal judges had already issued preliminary injunctions. And she didn't have an answer. She literally said, "I'll have to get back to you on the specifics of those cases," which is press secretary speak for, "I don't know, and I wasn't briefed on this." Then came the question that really exposed how unprepared this entire operation was. A reporter asked about reports, which had been circulating for about 48 hours at this point, that European allies had expressed serious concerns in private diplomatic channels about the administration's recent decisions on security commitments and trade policy. This is the kind of question that every competent White House communications team would have seen coming from a mile away and would have had a prepared response for. But the press secretary, instead of pivoting to some version of, "The president has strong relationships with our allies and we're in constant communication," went on this bizarre tangent about how some countries don't appreciate America's strength, and how the president isn't going to apologize for putting America first. Which, fine, that's a political message, but it completely sidesteps the actual question, which was about whether allies are losing confidence in American commitments. And then, and this is where it crosses from bad press conference to absolute disaster, she said something along the lines of, "If certain countries want to question our commitment, maybe they should look at their own contributions to collective security," which is basically code for threatening allies in public during a press conference, which is the kind of thing that makes phones ring off the hook at the State Department and sends career diplomats into panic mode. But we're not done, because at this point, about 20 minutes into the press conference, you could see the press secretary looking off stage, clearly getting some kind of signal from her team, and then Trump himself walked out. And let me be clear about something. When a president shows up unannounced at a press briefing that was supposed to be handled by staff, that is not a sign of strength or confidence. That is a sign that the operation has gone so far off the rails that the principal felt compelled to personally intervene. And what followed was, honestly, one of the most chaotic exchanges we've seen from this White House. And that's saying something given the history here. Trump immediately went on the offensive, calling out specific reporters by name, dismissing questions as fake news before they were even fully asked, and at one point literally saying, "I'm the president, I can do whatever I want within the Constitution," which, legally speaking, is a statement that would make any constitutional law professor break out in hives. The problem isn't just that the statement is wrong, though it is wrong. The problem is that it reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of how executive power works in a system of separated powers and checks and balances. During this impromptu appearance, Trump was asked directly about reports that Republican senators had privately expressed concerns about the administration's approach to various policy areas, and his response was to say that he wasn't worried about the Senate, because they know I won the election, and they need me more than I need them. Which is an interesting theory of political capital, but one that completely ignores the reality that Congress, and we're already seeing signs of that, with Republican senators making increasingly pointed comments about the need for constitutional governance and respect for institutional norms, which is senator speak for, "We're getting really uncomfortable with where this is going." The press conference eventually wrapped after about 45 minutes, but not before Trump made several more statements that are going to cause problems for his team. He suggested that federal judges who rule against his executive orders are politically motivated and don't understand the threats facing this country. He dismissed concerns from European leaders as overblown and said that, if they want American protection, they'll come around. He claimed that, "The media is working with Democrats to undermine my presidency," which is a line we've heard before. And perhaps most damaging, he said that anyone in his administration who isn't 100% on board with the agenda should think about whether they want to be here, which is effectively publicly threatening his own staff, and all but confirming the reports of internal turmoil that the press secretary had just tried to downplay. Now let's talk about what a White House press conference is actually supposed to do. because I think a lot of people don't fully understand why this particular disaster is so significant. A press conference, especially one that's called on short notice to address concerns or misunderstandings, has one primary job: control the narrative. You're trying to get your message out in a clear, consistent way that makes your administration look competent, informed, and in control. You're trying to reassure allies, calm critics, and give your own party members something to point to when they're asked about whatever controversy is swirling around. You prepare extensively. You do murder boards where your team throws the hardest possible questions at your spokesperson, so they're ready for anything. You have talking points that everyone sticks to. You have a clear beginning, middle, and end, and you know exactly when you're going to wrap it up and walk away. What you absolutely do not do is go into a press conference unprepared, give rambling answers that contradict each other, volunteer information that makes things worse, and then have the president show up to make even more inflammatory statements that generate entirely new controversies. That's not crisis management. That's crisis acceleration. And here's the thing about crisis communication that this White House either doesn't understand or doesn't care about. Once you lose control of the message, once you've given the press and your opponents ammunition to use against you, you can't just take it back. Those quotes are out there now. Those moments of visible confusion and defensiveness are on video. The image of a press secretary looking lost and a president looking angry and defensive is what people are going to remember. And in politics, perception matters enormously. If the perception is that your administration is in chaos, that you don't have your act together, that you're reacting instead of leading, that perception becomes reality in terms of your ability to govern effectively. Allies start hedging their bets. Your own party members start distancing themselves. The bureaucracy starts slow-walking your directives because they sense weakness. The media smells blood in the water and starts digging harder for stories about internal dysfunction. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, let's break down what this actually means, because this goes way beyond just one bad press conference. First, understand that what we witnessed yesterday is symptomatic of deeper problems in how this administration operates. This isn't just about poor communication skills or an off day. This is about an administration that, based on all available evidence, is struggling with basic governance functions. When your press secretary can't answer straightforward questions about personnel or legal matters, that suggests either a lack of internal coordination, where different parts of the White House aren't talking to each other, or it suggests a deliberate strategy of obfuscation that broke down under questioning. Neither of those is good. When the president feels compelled to personally intervene in a routine press briefing, that suggests he either doesn't trust his communications team to handle things, or he's so focused on the immediate fight that he can't resist jumping into the fray even when it's strategically unwise. And when the end result is more questions than answers, more controversy than clarity, that tells you that this administration is in reactive mode, not proactive mode. Second, let's talk about what this means for the administration's policy agenda. Every hour that White House staff spends doing damage control from a disastrous press conference is an hour they're not spending on advancing legislation, building coalitions, negotiating with Congress, or conducting diplomacy. Every cycle that gets dominated by stories about internal chaos is a cycle where you're not driving your own message about whatever policy priorities you're trying to push. And in a political environment where you have a limited window to get things done, where the 2026 midterms are already on the horizon, where your opponents are actively looking for any sign of weakness they can exploit, you cannot afford to waste time on self-inflicted wounds. But that's exactly what this press conference was. A completely avoidable disaster that now becomes the story instead of whatever the administration actually wants to be talking about. And the problem compounds, because now you have Republican members of Congress who are going to get asked about this by their local media, and they're going to have to decide whether to defend the administration or distance themselves from it. Some will do the former, some will do the latter, and either way, it creates division and distraction. Third, we need to talk about the international implications, because they're substantial. I mentioned earlier that the press secretary's comments about allies were inflammatory, and that Trump's own statements were even worse. Here's why that matters. American foreign policy, American power on the global stage, is not just about military might or economic leverage. It's about credibility. It's about whether other countries believe that the United States will follow through on its commitments, that it will be a reliable partner, that it will act in predictable and rational ways. When you have a White House that publicly dismisses allies' concerns, that threatens to withdraw support if countries don't come around, that suggests allies are ungrateful or weak, you are actively undermining that credibility. And that has real consequences. European leaders are watching this and making decisions about how much they can count on the United States. Asian allies are doing the same calculations. Adversaries like Russia and China are watching this and seeing opportunities. They're seeing an administration that appears chaotic and distracted. And they're asking themselves whether this is a good moment to test American resolve in various theaters. They're looking at the divisions between the White House and Congress, between the White House and the courts, between the White House and its own staff, apparently. And they're seeing a system that might be too internally focused to respond effectively to external challenges. Fourth, let's address the legal and institutional dimensions of some of what was said during this press conference. When Trump made the statement about being able to do whatever I want within the Constitution, he's technically correct in the narrowest sense that the president's powers are bounded by the Constitution. But the way he framed it, the context in which he said it, suggests a much more expansive view of executive power than most constitutional scholars would accept. The president cannot, in fact, do whatever he wants even within constitutional boundaries, because the Constitution creates a system of separated powers with checks and balances. Congress has the power of the purse. The courts have the power of judicial review. The president's powers, while substantial, are not unlimited. And when a president talks as if his powers are essentially unlimited subject only to his own interpretation of constitutional bounds, that's when you start to see institutional pushback. We've already seen it with federal judges issuing injunctions against various executive orders. We're seeing it with increasing restlessness in Congress. We're seeing it with bureaucratic resistance from career officials who believe the administration is overstepping. And the more the president talks in these terms, the more he invites that pushback, because he's essentially daring the other branches to check him. Fifth, we have to consider the political calendar and what this means for Republicans heading into 2026. The midterm elections are now less than 2 years away, and historically the party in power loses seats in the midterms. That's just a pattern we see over and over again. But the magnitude of those losses depends heavily on the popularity and perceived competence of the administration. If voters believe the administration is doing a good job, if they believe things are stable and moving in the right direction, the losses might be minimal. But if voters believe the administration is chaotic, incompetent, or overreaching, those losses can be substantial. And what does a press conference like yesterday's do to those perceptions? It reinforces every negative narrative about chaos and lack of control. It gives Democrats ammunition for campaign ads. It makes it harder for Republican candidates to defend the administration's record because they have to keep explaining away these kinds of incidents. And it potentially depresses turnout among Republican voters who might start to feel discouraged or disillusioned. Now, we're still far out from 2026, and things can change dramatically in politics. But every data point matters, and this is a bad data point for Republicans. Sixth, let's talk about what this tells us about the internal state of the administration. The reports of staff resignations and internal dissent that came up during the press conference are clearly not just Democratic talking points or media fabrication, because the White House's own responses, both from the press secretary and from Trump himself, essentially confirmed that there is turmoil. When you have a press secretary who can't coherently address personnel questions, and when you have a president who publicly says that anyone not fully on board should reconsider their position, you're basically advertising that there are significant disagreements happening behind closed doors. And that matters for several reasons. It means that policy decisions might not be getting the kind of thorough vetting and debate they should get, because dissenting voices are being shut out or are choosing to leave rather than fight losing battles. It means that you might have an echo chamber effect where the president is primarily hearing from people who agree with him, which can lead to poor decision-making. It means that institutional knowledge is walking out the door as experienced staff depart and are replaced with less experienced loyalists. All of that degrades the quality of governance. Seventh, we need to consider the media dynamics and how this press conference is going to be covered and interpreted. The mainstream media is obviously going to report on this extensively, and different outlets are going to frame it in different ways based on their editorial perspectives. But here's what's undeniable. The video exists. The transcript exists. People can watch for themselves and see a press secretary struggling to answer basic questions, and a president making inflammatory statements. That's not something that can be spun away or dismissed as biased coverage. It happened in public, in real time, and it's going to be a permanent part of the record. And in the age of social media and viral clips, the worst moments from that press conference are already being shared millions of times, are already being turned into memes and commentary, are already shaping public perception. The White House has essentially lost control of its own story, and when you lose control of the story, you lose control of the political narrative, and when you lose control of the narrative, you lose power. Eighth, let's think about what this means for the administration's relationships with various constituencies and interest groups. If you're a business leader who was hoping for stable, predictable policy from this administration, what do you take away from a press conference like this? Probably concern about whether this administration can deliver on its promises, or whether it's going to be constantly distracted by self-inflicted wounds. If you're a foreign government trying to negotiate with the United States on trade or security issues, what do you think when you see this level of chaos in public communication? Probably that you need to be careful about how much you commit to, because this administration might not be around long enough or might not be stable enough to follow through. If you're a Republican donor who's been supporting the party because you believe in certain policy outcomes, what do you think when you see this kind of dysfunction? Probably that you need to think carefully about whether your money is being well spent, and whether this administration is capable of achieving those outcomes. All of these perceptions matter because they affect the administration's ability to govern, to build coalitions, to get things done. Ninth, we should address the question of whether this is recoverable. Can the White House come back from a press conference this bad? The answer is yes, but only if they make significant changes to how they operate. They need to impose message discipline. They need to prepare better for media interactions. They need to stop making unforced errors like having the president jump into a press briefing unannounced to make things worse. They need to address the internal staff issues, either by resolving the policy disagreements or by accepting that some people are going to leave and managing those transitions professionally. They need to repair relationships with allies through quiet diplomacy rather than public confrontation. They need to show, through actions rather than just words, that they're capable of competent governance. But here's the thing. All of that requires recognizing that you have a problem, and based on what we saw yesterday, it's not clear that this White House is ready to make that recognition. Trump's closing comments, where he essentially doubled down on everything and blamed the media and his critics, suggests someone who doesn't believe he needs to change course. And if the principal isn't willing to change, it's very hard for the staff to implement meaningful reforms. 10th, let's consider the precedent this sets and what it means for future administrations. If this administration can conduct itself in this way, if it can have press conferences this chaotic and still maintain support from its base and from its party in Congress, what does that tell future presidents about acceptable behavior and communication standards? Does it lower the bar for what counts as professional White House operations? Does it normalize chaos and combativeness as a communication strategy? Or does it serve as a cautionary tale about what happens when you lose control of your message and your operation? The answer to those questions will depend on how this presidency ultimately ends and how history judges it. But in real time, what we're seeing is a stress test of American democratic institutions and norms. We're seeing whether the traditional guardrails of media scrutiny, congressional oversight, and public accountability can function effectively when an administration seems to have decided that those guardrails don't apply to them or can be bulldozed through. And here's what I keep coming back to. This press conference didn't happen in a vacuum. It's part of a pattern. It's part of a larger story about an administration that seems to be constantly in crisis mode, constantly fighting with someone, constantly generating controversy. And at some point, that pattern becomes the story. At some point, it's not about any individual incident, but about the cumulative effect of all these incidents together. It's about whether this administration can govern effectively, or whether it's going to spend its entire term lurching from crisis to crisis, many of them self-created. And that question matters enormously, not just for partisan political reasons, but for the actual functioning of the American government and America's role in the world. The other thing worth noting is how this plays into existing narratives about Trump and his presidency. His supporters will likely see this as another example of him fighting back against unfair media coverage, of him refusing to play by the rules of the Washington establishment, of him being authentic and unfiltered. His critics will see it as further evidence of unfitness for office, of inability to handle the basic responsibilities of the presidency, of dangerous impulsiveness and lack of discipline. And persuadable voters in the middle, the ones who will ultimately decide elections, are going to look at this and make judgments about competence and stability. Some will give him the benefit of the doubt, others will be pushed away. But when you add up enough of these incidents, when the pattern becomes clear enough, it becomes harder and harder for even sympathetic observers to defend. There's also the question of staff morale and recruitment. If you're a talented person considering whether to join this administration, whether to take a role in the White House or in an agency, what do you think when you see a press conference like this? Do you think, that looks like a place where I can make a difference and do good work? Or do you think, that looks like a chaotic environment where I'm likely to be thrown under the bus and where my reputation could be damaged by association? The answer for many talented people is probably going to be the latter, which means the administration may struggle to attract top talent, which means the quality of governance suffers even further, which makes these kinds of disasters more likely. It's a vicious cycle. So here's the bottom line. What we witnessed yesterday was not just a bad press conference. It was a window into an administration that is struggling with fundamental governance challenges. It was a demonstration of what happens when message discipline breaks down, when preparation is inadequate, when the principal can't resist making things worse, and when the cumulative effect of constant controversy starts to take its toll. The immediate consequences are political. Bad headlines, ammunition for critics, unease among allies and supporters, but the longer-term consequences could be more serious. We're talking about potential damage to American credibility internationally, potential weakening of the administration's political position domestically, potential inability to advance a policy agenda because too much time and energy is consumed by damage control. We're talking about an administration that may be entering a downward spiral where each crisis begets another crisis, where staff departures lead to less experienced teams, which make more mistakes, which lead to more crises. Now, is this the end of the Trump presidency? No, of course not. Presidencies can recover from bad press conferences. They've done it before, they'll do it again. But recovery requires recognition of the problem, strategic adjustment, better discipline, and a commitment to doing the basic work of governance effectively. And the question hanging over everything right now is whether this White House is capable of making those adjustments, or whether we're going to see more of the same over the coming weeks and months. The press conference yesterday suggests more of the same, but we'll see. Keep your eyes on staff moves over the next few weeks. Watch to see if there are more high-profile departures, because that will tell you whether the internal situation is stabilizing or deteriorating further. Pay attention to how Republican senators and House members talk about the administration in coming days, because any daylight between them and the White House is significant. Watch how allies respond in their private diplomatic communications, because if you start seeing public statements from European leaders expressing concern or frustration, that's a sign that the damage to relationships is real and substantial. And most importantly, understand that this is not just political theater. This is not just Washington drama that doesn't affect real people's lives. The competence and stability of the administration matters for policy outcomes that affect millions of people. It matters for American security and prosperity. It matters for the functioning of democratic institutions. When the White House is in chaos, when it's spending all its energy on damage control and internal drama, real work doesn't get done. Legislation doesn't get passed. Diplomatic relationships don't get managed. Crises don't get handled as well as they should be. And all of that has consequences that ripple out far beyond the Beltway. So this story is worth paying attention to, not because it's entertaining or because it generates clicks, but because it tells us something fundamental about the state of American governance right now, and where it might be heading. This press conference was a disaster, yes, but more than that, it was a symptom of deeper problems that aren't going away anytime soon, unless something significant changes. Keep watching this space, because the story is far from over, and the next few weeks could be absolutely critical in determining whether this administration can right the ship, or whether we're going to see the situation continue to deteriorate. And that's something that should concern everyone, regardless of their political affiliation. Because a functional government is in everyone's interest.